Hi, Journeyers. I'm Tony Carnes for a journey through NYC Religions Television. Thank you for being with us. The world has changed, the city has changed, religions has changed, politics has changed. Ever since we started in 2010 to sort of widen the public square so that religious voices would be counted with the same space and safety as secular voices, we've been working at that. But now we're finding that the situation's changed so much that there are new problems on the horizon that we need to handle. We need to change how we do our journalism, and we need to help our fellow journalists also change with the times. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We think it will be valuable for everybody because we all have to face these changes. And I've asked our producer, Brian Finnerty, to be with us because he's very experienced. He knows journalism all over the country. And I think it'd be really helpful, Brian, to have you here to sort of help me think through this.
Tony, happy to be sitting on this side of the camera with you this time.
You know, you brought up to me about you were in a doctor's office.
An ophthalmologist. I'm okay, by the way. I'm okay.
Okay.
Just today, I was in an ophthalmologist's office, and I overheard someone saying, "Hey, it's awful what happened at the opening ceremony. How this was a deliberate way of desecration for against the Catholic Church." And also a family gathering this weekend in which that same theme came up, and so there's certainly a lot of buzz about what happened during the opening ceremonies at the Olympics, and maybe you can fill people in on what happened. Maybe it wasn't quite, or maybe it was or was not exactly as people perceive it. So fill us in on that.
Well, I will tell you my experience with this controversy through social media has told me that how we do a journey through NYC religion has to change. And let me set you up how this started. Thomas Jolly, who's the artistic director, started planning sort of a series of tableaus, sort of dramatic spots along the Seine River. And one of them looks like it was replicating Leonardo da Vinci's painting, The Last Supper, but instead of Jesus, of having a very well-known obscene star of various scenes, along with a lot of others that were sort of notorious in their practices or in their acting or so forth. And they all were lined up looking like they might be, yes, at the Lord's Supper. And she had a halo around her.
And it also said like it was also there's this type of object to hold the Eucharist at in certain Catholic services or whatever, and that it looked like that as well. So
that's right.
Another representation there that was supposed to
the Catholic Church and many Christians and many other non-religious said, this is really blasphemous. Why are you saying you're uniting us in the world at the Olympics and you're doing something like this, which is a wholesale attack on one religion? The defenders, who also were from a variety of religions and political persuasions, though a variety of religions, they tend to be all of one political persuasion, said, no, you guys are so stupid. This is just the god Dionysus celebrating, having a great time and including everybody in the party.
Right. I mean, to me, that raises a couple, some different questions. I mean, it looks to me, whatever was in the mind of the creators, it looks like it's very unlikely that there are Catholics or conservative Christians or people who have those types of sensitivities that were part of the vetting process. Yeah, so I think if somebody else's ox was being gored, it's probably unlikely that something like that would have gotten through. Another thing that reminds me of it is just that same week, there was a story in the New York Times about how Hollywood is changing its approach. So there had been a long trend of films that were sort of trying to advocate some cause, some quote unquote woke cause or something like that, and a lot of Hollywood is sort of saying, hey, those types of movies don't make as much money as we want, and maybe we should make movies that people actually want to see. And that so studios are thinking about realigning this. And maybe maybe the producers of the Olympics may find that they've alienated a lot of people because this type of thing was not really completely thought through. What do you think?
Well, they're trying to put out lots of PR how well they're doing. I don't know whether they're doing well or not. What was revealing to me is that what interpretation you had, was it a blasphemous portrayal, a mockery of the Last Supper, or was it a Dionysian god having a good time? Didn't depend on your religious faith so much. It depended on, in America, it depended on your politics. If you were a Trumper, you automatically saw it as blasphemous. If you were an anti-Trumper, you tended to see it as just a Dionysian good time. In other words, how you actually defined the event was different. Now, look, there were people on both sides. Conservatives and liberals were on both sides. But what divided, I believe, what I saw in my social media was they were fiercely divided, not because they wouldn't look at the evidence, but because they were either so pro-Trump, they automatically said, this is why it means, I don't even need any reporting about what's going on, or they were anti-Trump and saying, this is just a good example of the idiots on the other side. But I started to say, wait a moment, you need to find out, well, what was the intention? What was the back door, the behind-the-scenes purposes? Did they really study Leonardo da Vinci's The Last Supper and decide, let's make it a close approximation? Or did they just study Dionysian paintings, which there are some? But in fact, people were not interested in finding out what the historical, the factual background was. They had already made up their mind. Well, I found out that the Olympic Committee released to one news service saying that, yes, it was based on Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper. Mm-hmm. So the fact was, it looks like it was based on that. However, soon afterwards, Thomas Jolly, the design director, said, no, he never intended that. He was following Dionysus. But then one of the actors in it said, oh, what we want you to do is to be real provocative.
Yeah.
So those were contradictory. But you know what? When I talked to people on either side, they didn't care. Said, oh, well, we don't care. You're wasting your time doing reporting. The other side said, well, we don't believe you anyway because we've already made up our mind. And I thought, wow, this is different. It's not based on what religion you are. I found Christians on both sides, for example. I found Christians who said it was blasphemous. I found Christians who say it's just Dionysus having a good time. Yep. And the difference was not their faith, whether they were Hindu or Buddhist or Christian, Roman Catholic, Protestant. The biggest difference was this division in society that's been capsulized by Trump and anti-Trump. And that there's derangement in thinking on both sides. And that's when I realized, oh, we've opened the public square so people of religious voices could have voice equal to seculars and not feel like they're always repressed. And that reporters should honor that. But now something's overriding that, and we're going to have to address that too.
Yeah, it seems like sometimes a certain sense of satisfaction about floating some sort of conspiracy theory that, that advances your side of the agenda. Or like, hey, did you hear that? I think this is not true, but hey, did you hear that the Secret Service were told to stand down? And people will say that, and it's a little bit titillating or whatever, and absolutely inflammatory. But it might sort of advance my side, so I'm going to say it. It doesn't really matter if it's true or not, because it's sort of fun and it beats down the other side.
And what's also disturbing is that even if it comes out that you know the truth about it, that is, well, they were called to stand down or they weren't. And I don't think they were, but
yeah, obviously, let's say I don't think they were.
Well, we're just using an example. But even if you find out that truth, you know what happens is it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
And so even if we do our journalism at Journey well, and with sympathetic objectivity, being representative of the city, opening up the secrets that nobody had seen before, you know what? People say, okay, fine. But we don't care because we're busy, pummeling the other guy. And it's not religion only that's dividing them. There is some division between the seculars and the religious, but on this Paris incident, what struck me is, Journey is going to have to change and reportings have to change.
So Tony, before that, why don't you talk a little bit more about the whole foundation of your approach has been sympathetic objectivity. So explain a little bit what you mean by that, and so what has to change about that approach, and actually you've had success with that in terms of trying to talk to folks like the New York Times and others about that. But let's explain what that is and where that's going and what you found the limits have been.
Well, sympathetic objectivity, the editor of Fast Company summarized it as open mind and open heart makes for better stories. What it is that you look at a person that you're interviewing, and rather than you trying to be objective, because I don't think we're really ever objective, you actually try to be empathetic and sympathetic, to take their viewpoint. And you ask yourself, what are they saying that all the rest of us ought to hear about? And furthermore, some of what they're saying, maybe I just need to put in my own life. And then also the sympathy has so empathy is knowing what they're thinking and feeling and seeing how that might improve my thinking and feeling and perception. And also sympathy means two things. One, seeing something they're doing that's really good, and we should be sympathetic to it and practice it. But second, if they're hurting in some way, if they're spiritually ill in some way, if they are saying that, I went through a rough time and I found help, we need to be sympathetic for the pain they've heard. We really root our thinking in the parable of the Good Samaritan. Many people think, and by the way, every time I say this, people say, no, that's not what the Good Samaritan parable is about. No, the Good Samaritan parable is about you looking at somebody that's very different from you, the Samaritan. In first century, the Samaritans were heretics, idolaters, immoral, and were opposed to the other Jews. And they had different ideas of holiness. And furthermore, just right about the time, just a few years after Jesus died, the Samaritans actually killed a couple of Jews that were walking through going to Jerusalem, because they believe you should go to Shechem to worship, not Jerusalem. So when Jesus was saying, go look at the Good Samaritan, first of all, his audience would say, there is no Good Samaritan. It's like today we might say, there's no good Muslim, if we don't, or terrorist Muslim anyway. It's sort of an outsider. And then second, he said, you know what you can learn from them? You can learn compassion. What? From the Samaritan? From the Muslim? We can learn compassion? No. No. Now, notice, Jesus didn't become a Samaritan. He didn't say, well, I'm going up to Shechem now. I'm not going to Jerusalem to worship. No, he kept going to Jerusalem. But he said, you got to look at the other and have empathy. Now, we find that and sympathy for the other person so that you can see they have something to contribute to you functionally.
How might that play out in a concrete contemporary example?
That's why I often go to the Muslim, because the Muslims have been unusual in the United States, have smaller numbers, and sometimes in some places have had hostility because of association with the terrorist groups around the world, and so sometimes they've been looked on estranged, and too much so. But I used the example of Muslim. When we think of Muslims, what do we get from them that is actually, wow, really good? Now, the simplest thing is, we get food from them, all types of Middle Eastern food. But that's a little too simple. What else do we get from them that is really admirable, and wow, couldn't we do the same? I will give you one example that always struck me as amazing is, as you know, Christians used to memorize parts of Scripture, right? And if you would go in catechism, you would memorize certain parts of Scripture as a kid. Well, the Muslims take that to the nth degree. They memorize the Quran, and then they have contests. And it happens to be on the Lower East Side on Eldridge Street. There's a mosque where their kids have been memorizing the Quran, and they're world champions. And I thought, wow, if the rest of us only knew our scriptures as well as they do. And then I said, well, how can they get kids to be so enthusiastic to do that? See, now we're asking the question is, well, I'm not going to be memorizing the Quran maybe, but I am going to see how they do that and what impact does it have on the kids and what impact doesn't it have? You know, there might be some problems. So that's sympathetic objectivity. You go and say, wow, this is something everybody should know about. Have you memorized the whole Bible?
Not yet. But,
no, might not be either. I'm embarrassed when I go in because there's one or two of them that...
There's a famous program, podcast series, a Bible in a Year podcast you may have heard, which is really, really popular these days.
Yes.
Father Mike Schmitz.
Yes, that's right. He's very popular.
I think, I'll start with that before committing to memorizing the Bible.
Well, here's the problem with sympathetic objectivity, though. And Ari Goldman had became, in the journalism department, had liked it and adopted it, but he adopted it in his own way. At Columbia, the president decided she would talk to dozens, maybe over 100 student groups in the fall to listen to them, her listening tour. And in that listening, she thought she would show empathy. See, it wasn't sympathetic empathy. It was empathy, and it wasn't objectivity. She only practiced half of it, and this is where she failed.
Explain what you mean by that.
Well, she went and she listened. That's pretty good. But the students said two things. One, you don't have any sympathy for our cause because you're not saying, I'm going to raise money to aid the Palestinians who are being hurt. If you were really sympathetic, you would do that. And second, you didn't learn any from us. We told you all sorts of ideas and you took not one thing. That's the other part of sympathy. The other part of sympathy is, one, you care for their hurting, and two, you take something they offer that's really good. She didn't take anything. Now look, she's a great president, Egyptian-born president. She is really, we're really grateful to have her. She's a very fair person, President Sheffick, and I really hope she survives this turmoil because she's good for the Columbia University. But I believe that I learned through what happened is that, one, you got to practice the whole thing, sympathetic objectivity. You can't just be empathetic in reporting. Empathetic reporting's not enough. You got to have sympathetic objectivity, which means sympathy, empathy, and objectivity.
One thing I would suggest along those lines is for any group that's being covered is I would expect it to be very good if they could recognize themselves and how they're portrayed. If it comes out, if the article comes out and says, hey, and these guys are in favor of this and this and this, and they're really passionately about that and that and that, and these guys think, that's not who I am at all. I mean, at the starting point should be to be able to recognize yourself and how you're being portrayed. That's
really good, and maybe they didn't think that since the president didn't take any suggestions from them and didn't feel the sympathy. They felt like, in fact, she just said, I want to encourage you in your studies at Columbia. Like, I heard you, but now you need to listen to us. Students don't like that so much.
I can tell you about conversations I've had with the two different sides.
Yeah.
That I thought was sort of fascinating. So there's one moment in which there's a pro-Palestinian protest. This is on 34th Street in Broadway or something like that, in the middle of the intersection, and some woman is holding up a Free Palestine sign. And I thought, well, that's interesting, so I go up to I went up to her and said, I saw your sign. Could you tell me? So, are you by that sign? Are you calling for the destruction of the state of Israel? And she looked like she was a little annoyed that I had asked her a question, and then she said, "Well, yes, but we're not calling for the destruction of the people." Well, okay. Well, obviously, yeah.
It's very
obviously,
shallow.
Some people are going to die if you're taking down a whole state like that.
Well,
Yep.
this points out one place where sympathetic objectivity doesn't work.
Yeah.
And it didn't work at Columbia.
Can I just tell one other story?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, please.
The flip side for that, for me, which I found fascinating, like there's one time there's someone from like the Israeli tourism office or something like that who was at some conference that I attended, and he talked about people are denying the right of Israel to defend itself, and I approached him afterwards, and I said, well, in terms of what you're trying to put forward in terms of promoting Israeli tourism and stuff like that, entering into that may not be that helpful, because when you just phrase it that way, it almost implies that any discussion of the deaths of civilians is off the table, and you might really think about if that's really a helpful phrase to use. And then he just simply doubled down. I mean, we're basically, hey, we're doing everything right, and any criticism of what we're doing is completely misguided. So it's a challenge.
Well, what I found at Columbia, and you've brought out a lot of the complications. Sympathetic objectivity would have helped a lot, but at some point, where the students that were pro-Hamas, who would not let you go to certain parts of the campus because you didn't agree with them. They roped them off. You couldn't get in. Or they occupied a building and wouldn't let you in if you disagreed with them. Sympathetic objectivity breaks down. They cannot handle that too well. There you have to have a commitment to civic order, and I would say a democratic civic order, which means you do call in the police to empty buildings. You don't let them capture part of the campus and push everybody else that doesn't agree with them out. So at that point, you do have to have a commitment to also upholding the civic order. So sympathetic objectivity, I now would add, can only work with the addition of a commitment to a civic order. That is, you should both be able to listen to each other and talk with each other and empathize and sympathize with each other, but you can't just shut one out.
Yeah, but it's not about just simply shouting the other guy down.
Yeah, and so I think that that's one way I would change, that sympathetic objectivity is not the full solution. And Journey needs to ask people how people uphold the civic order in their religious group. So I think that's a new thing for us. I also think that that we're in a different age than we were in when we started. When we started, we wanted to basically push the secularists from being secularists to and exclusive to being allowing the religious to be on the public square with them, and they could debate it out themselves and talk and feel safe. And we've made a lot of progress in that. And we convinced a lot of people in journalism to move that direction. But we're not in that age, because Paris showed me we're in a more anxious, more hostile, more confrontive, more isolated and fracturing age. And somehow we have to cover religion by covering that. Robert Putnam in 2000 said we're entering the age of bowling alone. Mm-hmm. That is, we're no longer drawing groups that are beyond our immediate friends and family. Mm-hmm. That texture of what Peter Berger called the little platoons of society, those things in between the big institutions and the family, they've withered away. Then, so many people would say, well, this started, Putnam's 2000 book is where it started. We started in July in 2010, and we felt like the big thing was opening the society, recognizing we're a post-secular society, that the religious have a voice also. In 2012, though, Jonathan Haidt says, the psychologist at NYU, Jonathan Haidt says all of this goes back to 2012. He said in 2012, in our testing of students, all of a sudden they became very mentally disturbed. They had so much mental illness in 2012. They just skyrocketed. So we need to change things. In 2000, they were isolated, they were fragmented, they were hostile to each other, they were suspicious, they were losing hope. And he said, we got to overcome that. Now, he thinks that came from largely from social media usage, that the young people that he was testing were so much on their social media that they were almost like, you know, separated from each other. And so right now he's trying to go around and talk about social media usage. I would remind us that actually the Hasidic Jews held a huge, with tens of thousands of rabbis and other Hasidic leaders in Shea Stadium to talk about whether their kids should be able to use social media a couple of years ago. So they were pretty far ahead, though they were more, you know, more absolutist on that. Tim Keller discovered that maybe it was 2017 when Princeton rescinded their award to him because of gender politics and politics. And he says that's when it started. But however it started, we are what I believe in some sort of age that's different. Jonathan Haidt calls it the anxious age. We're all anxious, we're all on edge, we're all ready to get at each other's throat, and we are all suspicious. I think a journey and journalists have to cover that and also cover how faiths are overcoming that. And if we do that, I think we'll be in much better shape. What do you think?
Well, let me just ask, as we're closing up because we're running out of time, do you think there's real hope? I mean, we're in a really contentious age, so what words of hope or despair would you leave our viewers with?
Well, you know, look, we started in 2010 that changed the way journalism is done in the city, and I think we actually helped a lot of that change. So we got a new task, and we're going to do something.